Today we're going to be comparing the Emmaljunga NXT90 and the Bugaboo Fox, two top-of-the-line luxury strollers to be had if you're in that spare no expense mindset. While there are many similarities to these strollers, reversible seat, four wheels with swiveling front wheels, comparably sized seats and bassinets, and the sort of textile quality that accompanies their high price tags, throughout the course of this comparison you will come to find these two to be very different animals. In a recent guide we did to help people sort through the many different categories of stroller existing in the current market, these two were not even placed within the same class, the NXT90 being a bona fide heavyweight, more akin to the Stokke Trails or the Upper Baby Vista, while the Fox is more of a souped-up mid-size model, built in the same weight and size class as the Chameleon or the Cybex Pream, only actually usable when you leave the mall. Let's start with a few stats. The Fox weighs in at 9.9 kilos versus the NXT's whopping 16. The Fox folds down to 66 by 54 by 19 centimeters versus the NXT at 76 by 40 by 30. Both have the same weight capacity in the seat, 15 kilos, which is undoubtedly an underreporting by a few kilos as it's the max allowed to report according to EU safety regulations. The Fox claims 10 kilos in the underslung shopping basket versus 5 on the NXT, but in the latter case I again think there is some underreporting. Okay, let's talk comfort and use. The immediate difference here is going to be a matter of weight. As a lighter and more delicate stroller, there's going to be a definite edge with the Fox when it comes to those times when you're forced to actually lift and carry your stroller, like going up and down stairs or pulling the stroller in and out of your trunk. Despite being relatively similarly sized, the NXT90 is a little bigger. This weight disparity is going to make a difference if driving a car is part of your daily lifestyle. On the other hand, the NXT90 is easier to fold and unfold, at least in the sense that it has fewer steps than the Fox, which has a bit of a nightmare of a central folding mechanism, but we'll get more into that in this mechanics section. Ease of maintenance is pretty split between these two models. Chassis-wise, all the mechanisms should be lubricated occasionally, though I would recommend silicone spray for the Fox versus a WD-40 type spray for the NXT90. The difference being the result of a higher number of plastic components within the mechanisms of the Fox. The NXT90 has air-filled wheels, which, though nice for suspension, does mean that you will occasionally have to deal with punctures and pumping. Switching from the carry cot to the seat is of course easier on the NXT since they're different units, but textile removal is generally better on the Fox since the textiles are fully removable, whereas on the NXT, the canopy is locked tightly to its frame with rivets, thus necessitating washing by hand. Driving-wise, both of these strollers are built with sort of the same concept in mind, though the Fox acts as a sort of mini or light version of the NXT. Both have low, wide footprints with an engineering emphasis on shock absorption and decently sized wheels, though the NXT does maintain a clear advantage for terrain and overall durability that we'll explain in a moment. Okay, let's move on to the mechanics of the models, going over these strollers top to bottom. We'll start with a few notes on the seat units. Both of these have ergonomic seat units, the chief difference being that the footboard on the Emmaljunga seat unit is actually adjustable. I have seen on some other sorts of strollers that have this sort of a design here, that over time, if you use a heavier child, you can damage the discs inside here that hold the mechanisms together, and then you have problems because the mechanism breaks and needs replacing. But I haven't actually seen this problem yet on the NXT90, and it seems to me like Emmaljunga has done a good job of taking a lot of their previous designs for mechanisms and making them a bit larger and more rugged on the NXT90. Another difference you'll find with these two strollers is the mechanism for adjusting the seat. So the Fox has this very common mechanism where you have a lever on the back in order to adjust lying down, sitting up, various positions. Whereas on the Emmaljunga NXT90 you have this very large bar that's attached to a mechanism here in the middle. And for me this does seem to be the sort of a setup that could cause problems over time because the size of this bar in relation to the mechanisms it's activating is quite large, which means that quite a bit of pressure is actually being put on the insides of those mechanisms. One last note I'd make is on the canopies. Emmaljunga has unfortunately continued to make this sort of canopy design where, as I said before, you can't actually remove the textiles, but the other part of this that is all stuck together with rivets is that when the rivets weaken, you do sometimes develop problems where the canopy has a tendency not to stay all the way upright. And we have seen this with the NXT90. It doesn't take long before it can happen sometimes. We'll move on then to the handle and telescopic height adjustment mechanisms then on both of these two models. The chief difference being that on the NXT you also have a handle position adjustment mechanism. On previous models of Emmaljunga, we had sometimes seen problems with this breaking or loosening, but they've made quite a heavy-duty setup on this current model. It even has a reinforcing plate on the back side. One thing you'll notice when you look at both of these strollers, of course, is that all of the pipes and the mechanisms are of a much larger dimension than you'll see on the Fox, and that's going to be a theme throughout the mechanics of these two strollers, that the general dimensions of the NXT are a bit thicker, a little bit heavier, and actually made with a little bit more durable metal and plastic than you'll find on the Fox itself. The telescopic mechanisms on both of these models function in more or less the same way, although the part for clipping into the notches on the backside of the handle on the Emmaljunga is all contained within the flap itself, whereas there are multiple components on the Fox for holding the handle at various points. The advantage of having multiple parts here is that when that eventually does wear down, it makes it a little bit easier to shift out those parts inside. The central locking mechanisms on both these models actually function quite differently. The Emmaljunga NXT90 follows a design that a lot of strollers have started to incorporate, where the handle via this telescopic mechanism slides down essentially into the front frame. Thus, the only job that the central locking mechanism actually has to do is to release the rear frame towards the front frame. I find that activating the central locking mechanism does take a little bit of finger pressure, but the mechanism itself is quite simple. It's just a matter of pegs from the central bar that hold the back frame in place. The back frame does have a tendency to get a little bit loose even right out of the box, but it's not the sort of looseness that's going to lead to any sort of braking, and it actually helps a little bit with suspension when you're going up over bumps. Now, Bugaboo, by contrast, has always had quite complex central locking mechanisms, and this is really the worst yet. So we have done videos where we open up this central locking mechanism and show you the sheer multitude of very small plastic parts and springs involved in allowing all three of these protruding elements, front frame, back frame, and handle, to essentially slide all together in towards each other. On the Fox, you can also activate the central locking mechanism both up on the handle and in the middle, and it's actually necessary to do both if you want to fully fold or unfold the stroller. The general problem with this sort of micro complexity that you have inside the Bugaboo Fox is that anytime things start to get a little bit misaligned, or you get a little bit of sand or grit sliding down into those cracks, you can wind up with alignment issues, and all of a sudden it will not be as easy to fold or unfold. And of course, there are more components that can actually break. Okay, we're going to have a closer look then at the lower rear end of the stroller. One chief difference is that the Emmaljunga NXT90 does actually have dedicated suspension, which is built into the back end, while the Bugaboo Fox also has suspension, but it's not actually located in the rear frame. It's a part of how the central locking mechanism has actually been designed. Of course, if the central locking mechanism also has to double as a suspension unit, it just means added pressure on all of those multitude of small parts. That being said, the Fox actually, for its size and looking at it as a size class essentially below the NXT90, does actually have quite good suspension. It's certainly better than any other sorts of mid-size strollers. The suspension, though, on the NXT90 does allow it to go over rougher terrain than the Fox. I wouldn't say the Fox needs to stick to city streets. You can take it in the park. It will function quite nice on dirt roads and sort of manicured lawns and parks. But the NXT90 can actually go over roots and rocks and up trails if you need it to. And a big part of that actually has to do with the suspension. In relation to the wheels, you do have air-filled tires on the NXT90 versus a foam-filled tire on the Bugaboo Fox. I actually like the foam-filled tire concept. I also like the raised ridge on the tire here. I find that improves driving a little bit. And I don't feel that actually adds that much more to suspension when you have a foam-filled tire versus the air-filled tire here. It would be different if it were solid foam as opposed to the foam-filled tire, which does have a little bit of give to it. When we're looking at the brake systems, I'm actually not a big fan of either of these brake systems. I suppose I would give the edge to the Emmaljunga NXT90. Brake system on this is a redo of an older brake system that they had on the Emmaljunga City Cross and a few other models. And the problem that has sometimes occurred with those older models is that you have like the whole brake system being a bar that runs through here on either side, activated by the pedal with quite a lot of like spring force there. And when you have rust or grit and dirt and things that accumulate inside there, it actually forces those pegs to wear down the pedal here on the inside. Now they have redone the system and made it a bit stronger and smoother on the NXT90, and I don't tend to see that many problems then with it as we have with the City Cross, but only time will tell if you're going to wind up developing the same sort of problems. Now, in relation to the Fox, which I do consider to be a worse brake system, my issues here are again about micro complexity. So the Fox has this flip-flop friendly on-off system where pushing down the brake once, clicks it on, pushing it down again, clicks it off, and having that as opposed to just having pedal down being on and pedal up being off, is that you have to add a whole bunch of additional components and springs just in order to have that on-off sort of a setup. And anytime you're adding additional components and additional springs and points at which things have to move and so on, you're creating new situations where the stroller can eventually develop problems or alignment issues or break in various ways. We have actually opened up the lower end of the brake system here. You can look at that video if you're interested. Again, you actually see a degree of micro complexity that you wouldn't suspect when you're looking at the rear frame just from the outside. Okay, we'll have a look at the front end of both of these strollers. First thing I'd point out is the NXT90 has very slightly larger wheels, but anytime you have larger wheels, you're going to have more drivability. Very important with the front wheels of a stroller. I'm not a super big fan of either of the swivel locking mechanisms on these strollers. I suppose I prefer the Fox, especially when you consider the size class. You're not going to be going over as difficult terrain, so less chance of it breaking, but both of them kind of rely on a very small plastic peg for holding that wheel locked into place. There's a little bit of suspension on both of these models in the front end. It's actually a little bit better on the Fox. However, I have noticed that with the NXT90, sort of the entire rugged shape and setup of the stroller itself means that you don't really feel like there's any sort of suspension issues with the stroller at all, even if you can't quite see where the suspension is as you can with the Fox. NXT90 is the only stroller that you can actually even like run for a bus and not really notice any sort of decrease in the drivability of the stroller while you're doing so. Both of these strollers, I do worry over time they might develop wobbly wheel issues, maybe 5-6 years in. I haven't seen it yet because neither of these strollers is old enough to show this sort of a problem. But what I mean by that is that both of these strollers do not have an inbuilt suspension pad protection type system where the fork locks into the front end. So on Bugaboo Buffalo, for example, you had a spring-loaded suspension pad that pushed down onto the fork, and what this does is it helps to mitigate any sort of damage as that axle sort of moves around inside just from regular use. The Stoka Trails has this as well. Neither of these strollers have that, and it is a little bit early to see whether they're going to eventually develop a wobbling sort of problem in the future. Overall though, I can't really say that there are any major defects to the front end of either of these strollers, other than that I don't really particularly care for the swivel locks. Both of them do function quite well over at least mild terrain and heavier terrain in the case of the NXT90. So which of these two strollers would fit you best? That's going to come down very much to lifestyle. Despite holding a lot of appreciation for the simpler design and rugged sturdiness of the NXT90, I would guess that the Fox will probably be a better fit for most people, due mainly to the weight difference. If you live in an urban or relatively smooth suburban environment and need terrain capability only occasionally for trips to the park, then the wheels and suspension of the Fox will work just fine. It also feels a bit more car-friendly to me. If, on the other hand, you live in the countryside, traverse relatively bumpy forest paths on a regular basis, or if you simply don't have a car and plan to use your stroller for long periods daily over several years, then the improved terrain capabilities and far stronger construction of the NXT90 will probably suit you better. In any case, we hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you have, we ask that you subscribe, as it helps us to continue making videos in the future. Thank you.